All right, so should I go now?
Yes, the floor is all
All right.
yours.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. All right, so yeah, this is something that I've kind of been doing with my students. I do some of it with my students, and others is just ideas that kind of relate to what I do. And so I thought, I should uh, tell other people about it, right? So I got a paper and this presentation as well. Um, so as we all know, the way we present consumer and producer surplus, well, the way they're defined in a typical textbook is actually graphically, right? So, we define it as, consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price, and producer surplus is the area below the price and above the supply curve, both up to, the quantity, either quantity demanded or quantity supplied, right? Um, Now, this these definitions for consumer and producer surplus, they lead to some issues for students, right? The students might wonder, why are these defined graphically? Why not algebraically? Like profit, for example, we define it as, it's simply revenue minus total cost, right? Uh, which is an algebraic definition. Why are these other things, consumer surplus and producer surplus, why are they defined graphically? Do they not have the algebraic counterpart? Um, so that's something students might wonder. Also, they might wonder, why exactly are those areas these things? Why are those areas that we just saw on the previous slide, consumer surplus and producer surplus? What's so special about those areas? Why, right? Um, Another issue, what is the difference between profit and producer surplus, right? I mean, we emphasize producer surplus anytime we're looking at a supply and demand graph, but in other circumstances, sometimes we're looking at profit. And so students might wonder, well, we're assuming that all these firms, businesses, suppliers are profit maximizing. Why do we care about producer surplus? Well, what is the difference between the two? Is there a difference? Like, are they just the same thing, right? Um, and then another issue, especially for students, who are either in high school, and haven't taken any calculus, or maybe even college students who haven't taken calculus, they might wonder, is it even possible to find consumer surplus and producer surplus if supply and demand are nonlinear, right? So, students who don't um, know what an integral is, and every time they see consumer surplus and producer surplus, they, and they got to calculate it. They're using the area of a triangle, or maybe a trapezoid, in other cases where there's some kind of market friction. Um, and so, you know, that's another thing that might, students might wonder about, right? And so we'll address all these issues with what I'm going to be going over today. Right? Oh, and yet another problem is that these definitions, they're not really always correct, right? For example, I mean, we often teach how supply is not necessarily defined for all quantities all the time, right? Like, we teach that supply is the part of the marginal cost curve that's above the minimum of average variable cost, right? And if that occurs at a positive quantity where average variable cost is minimized, then that means supply won't be defined for quantities, positive quantities below where average variable cost is minimized, right? Like this supply curve right here, it's not defined for all positive quantities, right? It just starts kind of abruptly, as you see, not on the vertical axis. And so if they take that definition from a typical textbook, that producer surplus is the area below the price and above the supply curve, they might think it's just that green area that's shown, right? Because that's an area that's between the price and the supply curve, right? And of course, that's not producer surplus, right? The producer surplus would be something greater than that, presumably, right? Um, so yeah, we'll be able to address this issue as well, right? All right. So we can move towards a better definition for producer surplus if we if we realize that what producer surplus actually is, if we're going to talk about it graphically, is that we can more accurately say that it's the area between price and marginal cost, right? So not just the part of the marginal cost curve that's supply, but the entire supply curve up to the quantity supplied, right? As is shown on this diagram right here. So we can totally avoid that problem, that issue that appeared for students on the previous paragraph, on the previous slide, by emphasizing that, right? It's not just the supply curve, it's marginal cost. It's, the curve that we want to think about as being part of the border for producer surplus in this usual method of depicting producer surplus, right? But from here we can do a little bit of math and actually find another formula for producer surplus, right? So if we calculate this integral, right, producer surplus, since it's the distance between price and marginal costs up to the quantity supplied, we get this integral here, right? And if we evaluate that integral, we actually see that producer surplus equals the price times the quantity supplied, which is revenue, right, minus variable costs, right, the variable costs up to that quantity supplied. So again, just to emphasize, producer surplus equals revenue minus variable costs, right? And this is actually what I emphasize, or what I this is the definition which I advocate for in another paper that's forthcoming, right? It'll be published in a month or two. Is that we should probably define producer surplus as this, right? That it equals revenue minus variable costs. And the fact that variable costs equal the integral of marginal cost is something that a lot of people don't realize. And I know this because it's a question that I ask people who are interviewing at Clayton State, where I teach. I've done tons of interviews with people, and sometimes I ask them, what's the area below the supply curve? What's the area below the marginal cost curve? And a lot of people don't even know this, right? I mean, these are people with PhDs. They don't realize that variable costs are basically accumulated marginal costs. I mean, once you point it out to them, it's probably, duh, of course. But here are the details, right? Just in case it's not obvious to you that variable costs is basically accumulated marginal costs. So if we assume that fixed costs are constant, which of course in the short run they are, then that means that marginal costs are both the derivative of total costs as well as the derivative of variable costs, right? Those two things are equivalent as long as fixed costs are constant. So that means variable cost is an antiderivative of marginal cost. So if we were to do that integral, right, then it's going to equal variable costs at the quantity supplied minus variable costs at zero. And of course, variable cost, if nothing is produced, is nothing, right? Zero, variable cost at zero is zero. So that means that integral is indeed variable costs at the quantity supplied, right? And so that's what led to that equation we have right there, that producer surplus equals revenue minus variable costs. All right. So the thing about that equation, that producer surplus equals revenue minus variable costs, is that it's very similar to the definition of profit, right? Profit we define as, it's revenue minus total cost, right? And then one thing that we do with that profit formula is that we factor out the quantity supplied and show that, for profit, it's equal to the quantity times price minus average total cost, right? So, I've done that enough times for my students that once I realize, okay, well, producer surplus is revenue minus variable costs, I realize, okay, well, we can do the same thing that we do with profit for producer surplus. We could factor out the quantity supplied and find that it's the producer surplus is quantity supplied times price minus average variable cost. And this, of course, gives us the area of a rectangle, right? So we've just we've just devised a way of presenting producer surplus as the area of a rectangle, right? Which can be helpful, right? Especially for students who are not familiar with integrals, right? So yeah, we can just use simple geometry rather than calculus. And if you notice on the previous slide, the only thing that's different between this diagram and a typical like supply and demand diagram is that, well, we're calling it marginal cost instead of just supply. And then we've thrown in the average variable cost curve. I mean, we could still call the marginal cost curve, could call that supply and just look at the part, where it's actually the supply curve. But if we throw in that average variable cost curve, then that allows us to draw a rectangle and say, hey, that's going to be producer surplus, right? And so it doesn't necessarily have to be this this shape that, if it's a nonlinear supply curve or a nonlinear marginal cost curve, it doesn't have to be a shape where they don't know how to calculate the area of it without using, they don't know how to calculate the area of it because they haven't taken calculus yet, right? So all we have to do is augment that the supply and demand diagram with the average variable cost curve, and we can portray producer surplus as a rectangle. So yeah, for students who don't know calculus, can use these methods to find producer surplus, even in cases when marginal cost or supply is nonlinear. And like I was saying, I mean, this was pretty much motivated by the formula for profit, where it's the quantity supplied times profit per unit, right? Price minus average total cost at the quantity supplied. Now, this approach, we're defining producer surplus as revenue minus variable cost. It allows us to see how producer surplus relates to profit, right? Because we can easily just subtract profit from producer surplus and find that it's fixed cost, right? Which is you can see that in that set of equations there, right? So we have producer surplus is revenue minus variable costs, and then profit is revenue minus total cost. So the two revenues, they cancel each other out. So we just end up with the difference between total cost and variable cost, which is of course fixed cost, right? Constant. So profit includes fixed costs, right? It accounts for fixed costs, whereas producer surplus does not. So that's something that I think is interesting to show to students, right? I think it can reinforce something that they learn early on in most principles courses, where they learn about fixed costs and the fixed cost fallacy, and how rational decision makers avoid considering fixed costs when they're making optimal decisions, right? And the way that it relates to that is that, one thing is that if they're maximizing profit, then they are maximizing producer surplus. So we can, by looking at producer surplus and profit, we know that if they're maximizing producer surplus, they're maximizing profit, and vice versa, right? So if they're maximizing profit, then they're maximizing producer surplus. And then the other thing is that we can relate it to the sunk cost fallacy by saying, well, if they're trying to maximize producer surplus, then they're ignoring fixed costs, right? So that illustrates how, when we assume that firms are profit maximizing or producer surplus maximizing, right? It's going to be the same behavior. They're implicitly ignoring sunk costs and avoiding the sunk cost fallacy. Right. So again, I advocate for a more general definition of producer surplus, right? Define it as revenue minus variable cost, which again, that's analogous to how we define revenue minus total cost, right? The algebraic definition rather than a geometric definition, which doesn't always apply all the time. Like I said, in that instance where supply isn't defined for all positive quantities of output. So we can if we use that kind of a definition, we can avoid many of the problems with the graphical definition by switching to this algebraic definition. So I say, why not define producer surplus as revenue net of variable costs? I've done it for my students, and it seems fine with them. And it reinforces the fact that, the height of supply curve is marginal costs. And so it makes sense to them that, the accumulated area underneath the marginal cost curve is variable cost. And so they can see why it is that producer surplus equals that area that they see in the textbooks that's between the price and the marginal cost curve. All right, so we've done this for producer surplus. We can actually do something analogous with consumer surplus, although it might not be as sensible to do it because, as we'll see, we're going to be adding a new curve that doesn't really exist, right? I mean, it exists, but it's not something that we study. It's not something that I've ever seen in any textbook ever, right? At any level, grad or, for grad students, PhD, or anything else, right? So anyways, let's just go through the exercise so that we can see, right? So consumer surplus, we can more accurately describe it as the area between marginal benefit and the price rather than just demand, right? We're just noting that marginal benefit, this is known as, some people call it inverse demand, or you can also think of it as willingness to pay, right? Willingness to pay per unit of each unit of output. Right? So that means we can, typically write an integral that consumer surplus equals, the marginal benefit minus the price accumulated over the quantities up to the quantity demanded. Right? And of course, that gives us this picture here, right? The typical consumer surplus. This time, instead of demand being there, we have marginal benefit. Although, again, that's not really necessary. I mean, they're essentially just inverses of each other. So it's the same curve, right? But it wouldn't be the same curve in the rare instances where the law of demand doesn't hold, right? Where there might be a part of the curve where marginal benefit is rising. If that's the case, then marginal benefit and demand won't coincide completely, right? But that's probably pretty rare for there to be a rising portion of the marginal benefit curve where the law of demand doesn't hold. Anyways, so again, we can evaluate this integral, right? If we define total benefits as the accumulated marginal benefits, right? So we're just summing up all the marginal benefits at each unit of the output or each unit of consumption, right? Then that means that, consumer surplus is the total benefit that consumers are getting from the output minus what they pay, right? Minus the spending that they spent on those goods, right? So that's one way that we can define consumer surplus. Instead of geometrically, we can define it algebraically, that consumer surplus equals total benefit minus spending, right? So yeah, rather than defining consumer surplus graphically, like I just said, we can define it as total benefit consumers receive minus what they spend, right? And that way, students can see that the consumer surplus that is typically portrayed in a textbook as the area below the demand curve and above the price, it represents that, right? It's represented by that notion that they're getting. It's like the net surplus they're getting. Where we're netting out what they pay for each unit of the good accumulated over all the units that they're buying, right? And this illustrates why it is that consumer surplus is that area on the diagram, right? Typically, the area below the price and below the demand curve and above the price. And of course, like I said, we can do a similar exercise where we find a rectangle, the area of a rectangle being, representing consumer surplus, right? So, like I was just showing before, we can say that consumer surplus, that's the total benefit minus what they spend, right? If we factor out the quantity demanded, then total benefit divided by quantity demanded, that's average benefit per unit of output that they're buying, minus the price. That's how much benefit they're getting net of what they're paying per unit, right, on average. And so consumer surplus equals that. And of course, those two things, quantity times like the net benefit, right? The average benefit minus the price. Those are the dimensions of a rectangle, right? The rectangle that you see right there on the diagram, right? So consumer surplus is going to equal the area of that rectangle. All right, so of course, we can add producer surplus and consumer surplus together to find total surplus, right? Or social surplus in some textbooks, right? So total surplus is the sum of consumer and producer surplus, right? So that tells us that, assuming the quantity supply equals the quantity demanded, right? So kind of ignoring maybe imports or exports, right? Or other kinds of phenomena where they're not necessarily equal, the quantity supply and quantity demanded. If we evaluate that integral, then that means total surplus may be calculated as the total benefit that consumers receive at the quantity that's being bought, right? The market quantity, minus variable costs, right? The variable cost of producing that quantity of the output. And then, of course, we can factor out the quantity, the market quantity, and find that total surplus equals that market quantity times average benefit minus average variable cost, right? And of course, that's going to give us, that formula. It describes, multiplying the dimensions of a rectangle, right? That rectangle right there, right? So notice that we have to augment, in this case, the typical supply and demand curve or typical supply and demand diagram with two additional curves, right? So we have average variable cost added and then average benefit, right? And by the way, average benefit, I mentioned that we're adding something that doesn't exist in any textbook I've ever seen. That's what I mean. Average benefit is not something that people usually talk about, at least that I have seen, right? So anyways, we're doing that. We're adding these two extra curves, average benefit and average variable cost. And once we do that, we can we can portray total surplus as the area of a rectangle, right? The rectangle where the horizontal dimension is the quantity and the vertical dimension is the average benefit at the market quantity minus the average variable cost at the market quantity. Excuse me. All right. So just some concluding remarks, right? So defining consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus algebraically rather than graphically, I think it can clarify these concepts for students, right? Instead of just saying, hey, it's that region on the diagram. That's what consumer surplus is, for example. If we define like what it actually represents is the benefit consumers are getting net of what they pay, that might make a little bit more sense to students, right? They can wrap their minds around it a little bit more. We also discussed representations of these measures that can be analyzed using simple geometry, right? So just students can find the areas of rectangles pretty easily, right? A lot more easily than doing an integral, right? Now, one thing about this is that it remains to see how beneficial these kinds of graphical representations are for students. Like I said, we're adding some new curves in there that when they're looking at just a supply and demand diagram aren't there, right? So that might complicate things. And I could see the case that maybe since average variable cost is something that students see normally, maybe just doing this for, doing the rectangular representation of producer surplus makes sense, but maybe the rectangular manifestation of consumer surplus doesn't make sense, right? I can see that being the case where it's kind of like we're picking, producer surplus as a rectangle, but not consumer surplus because average benefit isn't something that we study and average variable cost is something that we talk about, right? But anyways, even if these representations, right, these rectangular representations are not helpful for students, I think instructors should be aware of them, if only to deepen their understanding of these concepts, right? They can also be shared with students who are interested, just asking more about this, or maybe confused students who, who just really maybe want to know, like, why is it that area? Like, I think showing them these things might be able to help them understand these concepts more, right? So it might be good for outside of class, like during office hours or something, or after class, just as an alternative method of thinking about these concepts, right? It's always better to have multiple approaches to something than just one, right? Because you can probably reach more students that way. All right, so I guess I'll go ahead and open it up. Were there any questions or comments that anybody have?
Thanks for the great presentation. So at least this deepens my understanding for consumer surplus and producer surplus. Anybody has any questions? If not, I have a question for a general teaching. So when you are teaching this to your students, what level of students are you teaching for? I'm pretty sure most of my principal's class students would not like to see integrals in their classes anymore.
Yeah. To be honest, the only thing that I've done so far is I use those definitions, right? I use the definitions that producer surplus is revenue minus variable cost, and then I use the definition that consumer surplus is total benefit minus spending, right? And then I just use those to motivate, like, okay, well, that's why it is this area below the demand curve and above the price, or below the price and above the supply curve, right? I haven't quite got to the point where I thought, oh, maybe I should use these rectangles, right? Although I am tempted to do it, and I was actually just going over it with my students, and I was very tempted to do it for producer surplus, right? Because like I said, we go over average variable cost anyways, and they're used to seeing profit as the quantity supplied times price minus average total cost. So they could do something similar for producer surplus. But I didn't do it. I don't know. I'm kind of hesitant because I'm afraid that just throwing more at them might make them confused. But maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it would actually help. I don't know. But yeah, I do use the definitions, but I haven't used the rectangles yet.
Thank you. I think the definitions are great, but the graphs, especially for the consumer surplus, I'm concerned that going to confuse my students because at the beginning level, it's kind of hard for them to understand it. But I like it a lot.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think for professors it might be useful. It's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like it's just another way of looking at it, and I think it probably does deepen our understanding of it.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I was trying to find which of my textbooks does talk about, as you said, asking the economist about accumulated marginal cost equaling variable cost. And one of my micro textbooks uses it. And I was trying to find it while you were talking. I can't remember if it's Mankiw for principles level or Goolsby for theory and whatever I use for IO. I couldn't find it, but I think for the upper level students, they might, the ones who really actually want some more calculus in their classes, this would make sense as an alternative, do the textbook way so they've got some resource to go back to, but then introduce this as an extra, another way to look at this, tying in with whichever one of my textbooks already uses the idea of variable cost being the accumulated marginal cost in its tables. So thank you.
Thank you for the comments. Yeah, I did try to look through textbooks, and I do have I have the paper. It's a working paper written, and I did mention some textbooks and their approach, but I can't remember if any of them defined it that way. So yeah, I mean, if you know for a fact that they do define produce a surplus that way, I would appreciate, like, if you emailed me or something and let me know, like, which one.
No, actually not for producer and consumer surplus, but one of those books does focus on the comment you made about already introducing the variable costs or accumulated marginal costs. So
Okay.
kind of whatever that class was, it would kind of be a jumping off point. You always kind of want to anchor new material in something they've already mastered, right? And so
I see. Yeah.
for that class, whichever textbook that is that I couldn't find in a few minutes, that would be one to try it out there, just because they're already kind of thinking along another way to look at variable costs or another way to look at marginal costs. This would be the next layer.
Yeah, because if that's already defined in the textbook, then I mean, I would assume that they're showing that the area under the marginal cost curve is variable cost. And then you think of that rectangle, the price times the quantity, right? That rectangle. The other area that's missing from the rectangle is producer surplus. So it's right there. It's just one extra thing to point out, right?
I'll find whichever textbook that was, and if I could grab your email, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, it'd be great. It's Jesse's in at clayton.edu. All right. Should I go ahead and stop sharing?
Oh, I just stopped the recording. So
Okay.
anybody else want to ask any questions? It won't be recorded now. Nope. Okay, so thank you, Jesse, for the great presentation. It's actually deepened my understanding.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm always afraid at conferences that nobody shows up, so I'm happy to see there's quite a few faces in here.
You're popular. So our next session is it's at 1:30.
All right. Sounds
So
good.
we'll have a break from now on.
All right. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Okay.